Hi, everybody. My name is Nairobi, and I'm the host of the Power to the Flower podcast. Welcome to episode 8. Today's episode, we're going to be doing a deep dive into U.S. cannabis social equity programs. The reason why this topic is so important and it's good for us to kind of just get familiar with what exists out there is so that we can expand equitable opportunities to Black and Brown entrepreneurs who are looking to make it in the space. These programs, the social equity programs, were created by different states and different towns or cities to be able to address the historical disproportionate impacts caused by the war on drugs to Black and Brown communities. These marginalized communities are still marginalized even through the creation of some of these social equity programs, which we'll dive into a little bit in today's episode. The reason why we need to examine this a little bit closely is because though there are 15 main major programs throughout the United States that are social equity programs and in various different areas, not just in the East Coast, but also in the West and in different parts of the U.S. as well, in the middle and in the South, we're looking at diversity of programming, but still similar results. There is a report that was done by the MCBA, the Minority Cannabis Business Association, that takes a deep look into what these social equity programs actually do and what they've been able to accomplish. Out of the 2,300 or so applicants that they've reviewed and successfully looked at their programming and where they were at in their business application, they determined that there has not been much success even with the creation of some of these social equity programs. And the reason being is because most of these programs go unfunded, or if there are any funds available, they're usually available only at a limited time and for a limited amount of resources and money. So though there are millions of dollars, it does take a lot to start a cannabis business, but also to operate one successfully. For Black and Brown entrepreneurs, those who are already operating in the space, or those who are trying and those who have tried and those who have done so and had to leave the market, many of us know what it is that are the real barriers in this space. It's a lack of access to capital. It's also lack of real regulations, right? There's a lot of tight regulations that make it difficult for folks to be able to get through a hard application process in different states. There are much harder than others. But then there are also other complexities like having a real access to opportunity, right? Sometimes there's a limited opportunity in spaces like your own hometown for not being able to do business in a city or town that doesn't allow for zoning, right? Or doesn't allow for cannabis to operate in the space. So there's many various issues to a barrier of entry. But with the review of these social equity programs, I want to give a better understanding to all of us, those of us who are listening, those of us who are participating in the industry, and those of us who are looking to aspire to do something different, to really take a greater look for the collective on how we can actually improve where we're actually at right now. Though we do have to take a long look at the past and the strides that have got us to this point, and we want to acknowledge, obviously, the different changes, even on the federal level, such as President Joe Biden's move to reschedule cannabis, right? From Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Those changes are great, but they still don't really fully address equity in the sense that not everybody who has been criminally charged with marijuana distribution or any sort of cannabis charge to their record has had the same access of opportunity as a person who has not had that type of record and probably has a lot of money that they can spend into creating a successful business. And it's no shade, trust me. I want everybody to succeed, but I think that we have to take a hard look at what we're saying equity really is and what we're really putting out as an industry, whether it's through regulation or whether it's through a general operating barrier that we're facing and not really seeing. It's the invisible lines that some people can call out by name, but others, those who are usually regulating, have a hard time conceptualizing to change the landscape, to change the rules of the game so that businesses can actually thrive. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up on that point. That was the quick intro, but I want you to pay attention when we talk about these specific programs, which ones actually provide resources such as funding, such as technical assistance, and what that actually has done for some of these businesses. What different license types and exclusivity periods have been allotted to social equity programs or social equity applicants themselves? So we want to look at the holistic lens, but also recognize that for those of the social equities applicants that have attested to their own personal trials and tribulations, it should not be this hard if the goal is to really increase equity and see more Black and brown entrepreneurs in the space. If we can provide these resources that people actually need, and if we can do so in a manner that is timely, right, for a lot of these business time sensitive decisions and time sensitive business plan creation, right, whatever the details are to make a person or a business thrive, we want to make sure that we consider all those things when we're creating policy, or when we're at least talking about policy. And I know that I'm using the general we as we creating it, but we really all do have a role in creating policy. Our policymakers as well as our regulators really care about the input of the public. At certain points, you may see that that's true, and other points, it may not be so true. And certainly, it is varying in different areas of the country as well. So, I want to be mindful of those who may feel unheard in the space, because there has been so many different types of addressing issues in public lenses and doing through so in civic participation, but still not seeing the output that you're putting in or the results that you're looking to have a successful business. I want to acknowledge those voices. At the same token, to see that regulators, some of those who have actually taken into consideration public comment, those things are also commendable and are ways that we actually want to do this all together. I want you also to pay attention to who actually has a role in making these decisions, and more structurally, who can restructure the lack of decision making in specific areas in the country that there have been a stalling in progress in social equity itself. Trademark associations and business associations, specifically, business associations create a general voice for people to be able to speak on a collective policy issue that affects business. So when businesses join together, it's likened to when employees join together and create a union, right? And there's a representation at all types and levels of the government, right? And or even in terms of advocacy, there's representation in different types of experiences. So with a trade association or a business association, or even an advocacy group of some kind, a nonprofit that you may back, those type of entities can actually collectively amplify a voice, and together there is more power. And I've always said this in this podcast, but when multiple voices speak on an issue together collectively and can identify where there are pitfalls in policy that affects business, you're able to sort of not just quickly influence the decision makers themselves, but to provide a landscape of a conversation. You're able to change public discourse to at least amplify the message that you want to be heard. So as business owners, as people who are entering the space, or at least trying to, or those who are curious, and those policymakers and regulators who still do sympathize and understand that there are different levels of where we can do better, we still want to continue to advocate. There's still a lot of work to do, and you'll see so in the next couple of social equity programs that I'm going to highlight. So first, we will start with the East Coast. Let's start off with Massachusetts, my home state. Every state and city program that is a social equity program has eligibility criteria that determine whether or not an applicant is actually a social equity applicant. Social equity tends to first address those who have been harmed by the war on drugs. Disproportionately impacted areas are determined, by ways of high arrest records or by race, and who's been most targeted, whether by traffic stops, things like that, or even just marijuana related offenses by higher data points. So each of these different areas do have maps that tend to identify how they determine every area is a DIA or an ADI area, disproportionate impact area or area of disproportionate impact. That phrase may be relative depending on where you live. The social equity determinants or eligibility criteria first usually start off with the area that you live, or the area of disproportionate impact, or who's been impacted by the war on drugs, right? This could be by having a past criminal record that is determined in that way. Or if not you, it could be someone that is relative to you very closely that could cause an indirect or very direct impact to your own personal life by way of their criminality. So such eligibility in Massachusetts, for example, could be a spouse or a parent that has had a past criminal record, if not yourself. Another area of eligibility would be where you live, like I mentioned before, and also if you are an economic empowerment applicant, and those are just different programs that were allotted during another year and has not been reopened up again. So a very few and small window of people actually fit that criteria. But social equity applicants are really mostly determined based on where they live and who they are. And if you are a person who identifies as a person of color, that certainly adds to your social equity application, right? In terms of, even in your general application when some of those questions are asked for you. In some states, that actually does matter as well and is a part of your application. So think about any place that you do apply to where they ask what your ethnicity and your race is. Similarly, those social equity applications will have that question as well. So with Massachusetts, one thing to always keep in mind is that this program is not opened always. It is a technical assistance program, the social equity program, and it does provide reduced fees and to your annual license fees. It provides exclusivity periods for specific license types. As it stands right now, the exclusivity periods really do only apply to delivery because the social consumption license type has yet to be fully released and accessible to the public. We're still waiting. The Cannabis Control Commission needs to kind of flesh out their policies that are reflective of what could make a business profitable. And this is really important because delivery has been criticized in Massachusetts for failing to be profitable business types for Black and Brown entrepreneurs. This is important because this exclusivity period or applicants were only eligible if they were social equity applicants, of which a majority can be Black and Brown entrepreneurs or folks who have been in impact areas themselves or themselves been impacted by the war on drugs. When we're thinking about the eligibility and who is a part of these programs, we want to also think about accessibility, who can get into the program and when. Because if you're not able to access this program at all times, it may not actually be beneficial for you depending on where you are in your application process. You may want to wait, but then waiting for the next cohort can be daunting for some people who did have to wait for different types of cohorts. And cohort 4 just recently closed their application process, but for those who were able to complete their application and were able to successfully be a part of the social equity program and being accepted, I want to congratulate those folks and really advise you to really take advantage of the resources in that program itself. Because with social equity programming, you get technical assistance to help you understand what the application process is going to entail, and more so, what a business in cannabis will entail, right? And each time they tailor it based on feedback of past participants. So ideally, right, every program gets better and better. So just continue to pay attention to what those resources are given to you, and then maximize your status as a social equity applicant once you are one. So once you are a social equity applicant and you're ready to apply, look at the license types that are accessible to you. If those license types seem lucrative to you and you want to take advantage of them, like I said, delivery is exclusive to social equity right now during this 3-year exclusivity period. And this 3-year exclusivity period only kicks in or only kicked in when the first marijuana operator began to operate and commence their operations. So that's how different programs work, right? So it's the rules that are like finicky to follow sometimes, but also the programming that's available to you while you're ready to go ahead and start your business, right? So those things you got to keep mindful of and take advantage of when there are deadlines and when there are announcements of different opportunities ready to you. Even if you're not the most ready, you just want to still try to apply and see if those programs might apply to you and could be eventually beneficial to you in your journey of where you want to be. So it's good to just get a general sense, but these programs can start you out literally from an idea to then fully getting you to understand what the basic requirements are to starting and running a business, and even more so general insight for advanced courses with their advanced curricula available to those who finish the basic curricula in the SEP program with the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. So that's a general overview of the CCC's social equity program in Massachusetts, and the criticism for those who have been in the social equity programming and have tried to have also successful businesses that are accessible to them. It's also a challenge when businesses do have to shutter because some of these license fees, even though we do get reduced fees as social equity applicants, have been really difficult to maintain if businesses aren't exactly as profitable. The lack of profitability has to do in part with not just this high startup cost, but also the newness of the concept in the market. A lot of customer retention techniques that really have to be implemented along with strategic partnerships to really make these businesses successful. You also do need to have financial backing to be able to allow you to continue to have output. And, if you're really having to do and pay for fees, if the business isn't profitable for you within the first year, you might just let your license expire as to not have to pay for a $10,000 fee or even a $5,000 fee or a $2,500 fee, right? And so these things are important for you to consider if you're looking at what actually makes sense for you and whether or not you think those business challenges are something that you can overcome as a business yourself. So certainly take them into consideration, but examine the eligibility for your own personal journey and your business type and what you're trying to do, and your application, whatever it is that you're trying to get across. Make sure that you look and examine that piece first. It'll help you determine whether or not it's worth it for you. And I certainly would advise folks to look at their goals and even write out their business plans as they're thinking about what their business could entail. With every business plan, you want to make sure you have a vision, a mission, something that says to you what you're looking to successfully bring to the market that represents who you are and your efforts and also your resources as you're pushing this through as a business, right? With the many challenges and hurdles that are faced social equity applicants, there are those benefits to also still take advantage of. And as I mentioned, figure out what works for you and still do it in the process, knowing that you probably could find an opportunity if you ultimately feel that that is the most beneficial move for you. So that's my advice. Certainly not any legal advice. Full disclosure, I don't provide legal advice, but I want folks to be able to listen to this and take this as an opportunity to review what's accessible to them in their state or city or town. Massachusetts and New Jersey alike also give priority to those who actually have cannabis convictions on their records, right? So if you do have that on your record and you want to bring that into your social equity application, they do require you to submit those documents that say what your record, which is your CORI, right? Your criminal offense record information, right? So all of that would be able to say what your past prior convictions are, and if they're cannabis related, that would actually give you priority in your application. In New York, that's a similar thing, but in New York, they also prioritize that 51% of the owners must be folks who are from impact zones or designated impact areas. And so the best way to determine that is through the map that is provided in the social equity programming of each of these state and government websites. So you want to specifically look up the social equity program for the specific state that you live in. And if it's New York or New Jersey or Massachusetts, certainly look for the OCM website, which is the Office of Cannabis Management for New York. For the Massachusetts website, it's the CCC. And in New Jersey, it's the New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory Commission, or the CRC is how it's commonly called. These are the different governing boards where you can find further information on their website. Okay, so look at that piece. In the East Coast, some of the programs tend to be very similar. Like I said, the biggest differentiators I would say is just the ability to have access to it and when these programs are actually accessible to people. And more so, what type of benefits are really given to each individual in each state. So we want to talk about some of the key differentiators in New Jersey as well. So New Jersey also offers priority access to licenses for social equity programs. And they also do offer financial grants, which support social equity applicants themselves as well. New York also has a social equity fund, as well as Massachusetts. In a state like Connecticut, that is also in the East Coast, Connecticut has its own challenges as well. A lot of social equity applicants are required to maintain majority ownership, struggle to keep that in their social equity status because sometimes in order to make business successful and profitable, you do have to give up some of your equity in your business in order to maximize investments and to be able to maximize profit as well. So with the 51% ownership for the majority of the social equity applicants that are applying, even if they initially have that, if they're not able to maintain that, they can lose their social equity status. So that does become a barrier, right? Because you're still the same person that was trying to make your business profitable before, and you're probably just running into the need for money and the need for capital. And because of that, it becomes difficult to maintain a social equity status, and then therefore forfeiting yourself from all of the benefits that could bring you also a successful business. But I suppose the policy counterpoint to that, many people say that if you have the investments, then you probably wouldn't need to be qualifying for as many social benefits or benefits that come through a social equity program. I don't necessarily agree with that. I do believe that there is a balance and a fine line when you're understanding if you're in these positions where you're trying to acquire a business investment and you're also looking to still maintain majority ownership. Sometimes that can become difficult to keep, but then if you're still a significant majority owner or a significant owner, if not second majority owner or something like that, that still should probably be something that's considered because you're still the founder of the business and you're still someone who's looking to make it profitable. So that is a challenge for folks in Connecticut. There's also the political and regulatory threats and things like that that also are faced in New York, and with the recent resignation of their executive director, right? We're also seeing that in Massachusetts with the recent resignation, or actually the suspension of the CCC chair. There are so many different other political implications that could actually impact the social equity applicant as well, because some of these things can take away from the actual regulatory and governance piece of making business profitable. So there's a lot of contention sometimes in these positions with folks of that type of responsibility, because you're having to consider so many different individual voices as well as individual experiences, but still knowing the challenge of policy making and regulating. It requires a lot of focus on what the greater good is or what the interests of the regulatory members are. Sometimes it can become political very quickly, and it's unfortunate because really you're in a scenario, or a majority of the folks in the cannabis industry are in industries where we're beholden to a lot of heavy regulation. And so with the heavy regulation becomes a lot of decision making that affects business, and often there's stopgaps into what can make a business successful. So though those social equity programs exist, this is why we're looking at what those challenges are in each of these programs. In Rhode Island, there's a constant development of data going into the development of the social equity program there. And even just looking at the lack of fully established resources, and folks feeling like they don't have the necessary guidance in order to complete an application. That's also been something that's been criticized in Rhode Island, right? And we see this even happening in New York as well. Some of the challenges in New York that a lot of people aren't really realizing is just the challenges between the legacy market and the now legal market in New York, and how that impacts social equity. Because when we think about social equity, we want to include everyone in that conversation. We want to include people who are, still trying to make business happen for them, but doing it the legal way has never been the way to do it, right? So even though these rules are now set into play, if this has always been traditionally an illicit market, we have to be real about the fact that a quote unquote illicit market, we have to be very real about the fact that this can actually be a very intimidating time for some people to make that transition. And it could just be because we're not seeing a lot of success stories as a whole, though there are many success stories. I don't want to discredit those who have become successful Black and brown entrepreneurs, but as a whole, there have been a lot of challenges for some of these Black and brown entrepreneurs. And that's something that has echoed throughout the legacy market as well, just because some people may not see what the full benefit for them to go legal would be. And so the challenges on the regulators is to try to ensure that there's enforcement with following the rules or following policy or following the law, literally. But also then the stigma of this industry having been over policed already, there's a certain challenge that you're facing. It's a catch-22. It's almost the new age or the new wave of the disproportionate impacts in our communities, right? Just recently, a New York court fined an illicit cannabis business for operating for $15 million. That's a lot of money, okay? I know a lot of people that can do a lot of things with $15 million. But if you're in the space and that's how much it is that the court is calculating that you have been, illicitly making benefit and profit of, you should be aware of these social equity programs that exist, so that at the very least, in trying to transition, you can see what program benefits may actually apply to you in your own entrepreneurial journey. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of different things to consider. And a lot with these illicit or these legacy pop shops, right? You're seeing that they're running their own rules. And so the folks who are actually trying to follow and abide by the rules and have that social equity status and all of that stuff, they're really trying to make it so that their businesses are equally as profitable, right? But they're still, not necessarily having that same profit. And so it becomes a challenge for the true implementation and also the safety measures that go with regulating cannabis now that it is an actual legal industry in New York. New Jersey also has some of those things, but with the East Coast overall, we also want to look at areas like DC, where DC's market is totally different and has its challenges on its own for social equity. There's an emphasis on medical limits and opportunities in the adult use market. There's not a there's a medical program. There was once a gifting program, which we talked about before in past episodes, especially with our past guest, White Gloves, or Mike as I know him, right? So these are the type of issues that occur in DC, and the regulatory challenges also with it being the capital of the United States and not being an actual state. because most of these social equity programs are run through by a state governing body. And so with DC and its uniqueness, right, there's a lot of considerations that have to be had, just as being the host of the majority of federal buildings, right, and their hometown being in DC. We're talking about the U.S. Capitol, where they can decide whether or not the U.S. can even have a legal cannabis, right? And that's the same city that would host cannabis, right? And that juxtaposition between being a city independently and not a state, and then still being, still having that burden of responsibility for the government to be able to, both on the federal side, balance that line between city and state, and so, or city and federal government, since there's no state barrier. It's very unique, and it's a unique situation that also impacts cannabis business owners and operators there too. Further down south we have Virginia, and Virginia does have social equity, and we see that a lot of the legislative uncertainties that occur are the constant changes in cannabis laws, because that can become unstable environments for social equity applicants themselves, right? And that constant community engagement is also a challenge, because they're having to stay engaged with the logistical and funding implementation of equity initiatives that overall could really positively impact the same equity applicants that are looking to apply in Virginia. So Virginia and its partnering state, Maryland, right down in that general southern area, or the DMV area. One of the things that we see in Maryland is the lottery system challenges. So the social equity program in Maryland ran through a lottery system. And this was an idea that, okay, we would open up licenses, and, it would run through a lottery so it could be fair and equitable. But, lotteries tend to be unpredictable in nature, and it can very oftentimes discourage applicants, if not totally make them feel like this isn't fair. It does sometimes the opposite, where instead of based on merit, or instead of based on other criteria, or the free market determining whether or not they're a social equity applicant or can get licensed, there's a lot of the challenges that social equity applicants face with a lottery, feeling like there's not a real chance, even though there's a chance that's supposed to be presented as an equitable and fair way. So again, these are different systems and different modes of implementing a social equity or social equity cannabis type of program with each state, but everybody does it differently. And because they do it differently, there are different challenges as well. So with social equity, we do want to always talk about the folks who have been impacted, because there are negative effects to the war on drugs, and all of that has to do with a criminal record. We talked about the Corey and what that does for an applicant, but what it does for an applicant who is looking to have a business successfully as well, you want to look at opportunities to expunge, right? And in the state of Ohio, expungements have become traditionally and historically a little bit more difficult for applicants, because it has been seen as bureaucratic in the industry as a whole. It has been known to delay applicants in their entry into the industry. So just keep that in mind as to some of these barriers of entry and what actually really equates to social justice if we're looking to repair the harms of those who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. So in theory, they make sense, but when there's so many limitations that are beholden to regulatory ideologies that may not necessarily make sense in business, and specifically the cross between business regulation and equity, what is fair based on historical discrimination, based on historical negative policy. So we're looking at all of that, and the main culprit, or the main person that is affected, the main type of person, is a marginalized community member who these programs are meant to assist and may not actually be assisting at all. It could actually be doing the opposite. Michigan is an interesting state, because Michigan also has a social equity program, but they have an all-star program. And this all-star program is great in theory because it should recognize a lot more businesses, or it recognizes businesses who like meet a certain criteria, or you know have like outstanding type of accomplishments in terms of what um diversity goals or something like that they've done, which is really great. But the all-star program recognition may not be suffice to overcome some of these financial struggles that it takes to actually run a business, right? And it's financial and operational as well, because you do need support overall. um, and that's why the technical assistance programs are more helpful on the social equity front, because it can kind of preventatively teach folks how to deal with the operational issues too. But we have things like high startup costs, that this is something that's a challenge overall, because it does require significant investment, especially with a time like this where trying to secure funding can be difficult, since there's a sort of a dip in the industry in terms of, you know, equity funding. So what we have next is Illinois, Colorado, and Nevada. These three states are different in their own social equity front, but one of the challenges that we do see with the state of Illinois, which is where Chicago is housed and where the majority of folks of color you can see in different parts of Chicago, right? Some of the challenges are the burdensome requirements for applicants themselves, right? So to go and prove that you're a social equity applicant, you know, you have to have the specific requirements in Illinois, that can really even be burdensome with just getting documentation, right? So when you're looking at a document that explains your past or anything like that, like a query, getting access to those documents can be difficult and burdensome to the person who's looking to access them. But it's also the requirements of, you know, having a location sometimes, having a plan for your business to be able to get forth with one other piece of that application. So it's a lot of different levels of requests from the Illinois Cannabis Commission. So these are the type of things you must consider also when you're in Chicago. And then the challenge of not also being able to access loans, right? So you can't access just a regular type of loan, for the main reason being because loans tend to be funded by banks, and banks tend to be run or at least regulated by the FDIC. And the FDIC determines that non-illicit or illicit businesses cannot be bankable, right? So if an illicit business, quote unquote, because of the CSA Act and the Schedule 1 and everything, as it stands now, until the Schedule 3 implementations come into effect, we won't really see changes in terms of who gets access to loans. So again, that can be a barrier, as I've mentioned before. Colorado, it's another state, obviously, that has its own social equity requirements. We look at some of the complexities with regards to the available subsidies not being able to be sufficient or covering all of the costs for startups, which is understandable. And we see that with a lot of social equity applicants, the programming almost seems great. It's like you get a technical assistance program, you get access to a license, you get priority exclusivity. It almost seems so enticing until you realize that the biggest challenges tend to be funding and the operational pieces of really getting a business to be compliant. So with the regulation, there becomes a lot of compliance that one must abide by in all of these programs. And that's one of the things that are really important to know overall, because you do have to see that the significant challenges in every type of social equity program or overall in the US tend to sort of overlap the same themes. So again, the financial burdens along with the operational piece and sustaining a compliant business can be very, very burdensome. In a state like Nevada, where there are budding new businesses such as Planet 13, These are the social consumption lounges that are licensed types that are newly available, and they're sort of a new model, kind of like a delivery business, right? That is being introduced to the market, and these business types are expected to exceed a lot of financial um, reports of what we would know a business model like a bar could do, right? The reason being is because it's so new and it's an attractive industry. It's $1 billion industry right now. So to have a relaxing lounge area where people can commonly do that, where there's a lack of communal spacing, it's like having one bar in a desert of like a million deserts, right? That's what social equity or social consumption lounges can do for social equity applicants. It really can be like one of the new businesses that can boom if there's a place where commonly people can go and congregate. And some of these business types have been very difficult to access for social equity applicants. So that is something that is actually occurring in Nevada as well. Although, there's an effort to continue to make sure that there's equity in that. I do got to say, I know that the Nevada government has been trying to push for that, but I do understand that it can become burdensome because a lounge is similar to like opening up a bar and having those type of um, considerations when serving the public can be also burdensome on the cost. So having high startup costs is even more so pronounced with a social consumption lounge, especially if your state requires that you remain compliant in a lot of many areas. So it's a lot to consider. But in California, those social equity programs, because they vary, some of the social equity programs in cities like Los Angeles and Sacramento, right? There are significant type of correlating factors. Like there are technical assistance that each of these programs do provide, but there are also even key things like funding as well, or just getting familiar with the local process, which is more helpful sometimes because if you are required to have a sort of a specific local board or local review, it's good to be able to have guidance on the municipal level where you're applying to as well. And in California, the eligibility criteria for those who are curious to know for social equity, it's at least 51% owned by individuals from communities of disproportionately impacted areas in cannabis prohibition, along with having a residency requirement for a specific period of time. Your income must meet a specific criteria and area above a specific threshold. And then also other requirements for local programs, such as the core program in Sacramento, do apply. So some of them may be specific to specific areas in the city of Sacramento. So the ADI areas become a little bit more focused instead of just being the whole city of Sacramento. And those are the majority of social equity programs that do exist. The overlapping themes tend to be that social equity programs or social equity applicants must reside in a specific area of disproportionate impact. There are usual income requirements. There are also requirements for, or at least bonus points in the application process for those who have been directly impacted and have a cannabis conviction on their record. So these are the type of folks in the programs that are permissible, can be allowed to be social equity applicants if they pass all of the eligibility criteria in their specific city or town or state. So just keep that in mind. Some of them, the biggest requirements tend to be the majority ownership, right? Because it means that you have to maintain full equity of your company, and that means you are probably fully funded if that is the case, or if not, 51% self-funded, whereas the remaining 49 must be can be to other partners, but you have to maintain that full ownership. So I know I talked about a host of social equity programs across the US. In many ways, we saw how they were similar, and in many ways, we saw how they were different. But one of the things I want to mention is how we can make them all equally stronger. So first, we want to make sure that we strengthen our advocacy efforts to continue to include specific requests for resources that are financial instruments to positively impact these businesses and business owners that have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs. So we're not just talking about opening up access to loans, we're also talking about federal grant money to the point of which we can now say we're an inch closer into legalizing cannabis on the federal front. We should also just continue to legalize cannabis federally, or continue to help those states that have not made that push yet to realize what the financial benefits would be. But in efforts for us to get there, we still need to continue putting social equity at the front, meaning talking about creating funds and creating more funding availability for these cannabis social equity applicants in ways that are sustainable, or in ways that can actually enhance a business. And there are other things we can do. We can continue to advocate for lesser regulatory rules that are in many ways not fair, right? We want to talk about things like the two-driver rule in Massachusetts that has failed to be repealed, even with efforts applauded by many advocates, because the CCC finally accepted that in the state of Massachusetts, right? However, it has not made the changes that are required for a social equity company to successfully run a delivery business. So we need to look at the type policies that don't make lucrative businesses, right? We want to look at businesses that are lucrative and seeing how we can transfer those type of models, maybe even with less regulation, only on fronts that obviously are permissible with safety. But if certain things aren't so unsafe as we tend to think because of the stigma of cannabis, we want to be realistic to the fact that these are just businesses just like every other business too. That's what's really going to make these businesses profitable. So the ways we change and positively affect these social equity programs are by being direct in our advocacy, ask for financial instruments that would benefit social equity applicants, but also talking about the regulatory changes that need to ensure a freer market for a lot of these cannabis businesses to thrive successfully. Okay, so we want to look at what's going to help a business and what is going to help the applicant themselves. One of those things also we need to make sure we're always constantly waving the flag at and never stop talking about is the expungement and the record sealing that needs to happen for some of these equity applicants to successfully enter into the cannabis space. So you may not be able to open up a bank account if you have a felony or something like that, right? Or even being able to pull out certain documents because of the felony if it's related to cannabis, or if there's a cannabis offense that can prohibit ease of entry into the space. We want to make sure we at least allow for expungement, because it could open up more financial opportunities as well for folks who have been previously impacted. So this is what I mean about policy. The best ways to change that is by way of creating more inclusive expungement policies, and record sealing opportunities for those who have been harmed by the war on drugs. We also want to look at how we can tailor the technical assistance to the most realistic and most up-to-date real-time business practices that affect businesses currently. So there's ways that people can stay on the thumb and on the beat by looking at what different businesses are struggling with currently and actually implementing that every single time before there's a new wave of entry for a social equity program. So thinking about those different things really matters. And then, of course, the community engagement. I think that the local community benefits are great when you think about what cannabis can do for a city in terms of taxes. It can also create opportunities for people to think about how we can have access to cannabis, but also advocate for drug safety or the youth safety without access to drugs, right? So we want to make sure that everybody who has concerns about youth access to cannabis is actually thoughtfully represented in the conversation, so that they're looking at how social equity programs can really bring a safe space to those who were once younger and had access to cannabis at a young age. And those decisions may have impacted them in the past. But we also want to talk about, for the future, how can we prevent these measures? How can we make it so that those who, even in their juvenile state, may have been negatively impacted, see a positive for their future? So, all that to say, there are ways we can improve this type of model, but the best way to do that is by doing that together. So, band up with your favorite advocates, with your favorite business associations, talk to your legislators. Don't ever feel like your voice doesn't matter, and continue to amplify the issues that you're facing, no matter in which state or application stage you're in. Okay, so that is really important. I want that to be the biggest takeaway. The power is within you. I know we talk about this being the power to the flower. We do want to empower those who like to smoke weed, of course, but it's really not just about the plant. It's not about the flower itself. It's about the individuals who consume, the individuals who participate in the industry, and those who are looking to make this a more equitable and safe space. Without you all, we wouldn't be here today, and we wouldn't be where we are in the future without the continued amplified voices. So keep doing what you're doing, and feel encouraged in that these programs are meant to be accessible for you. And though there are valid critiques about the lack of success in this space, the more we continue to advocate and push, the more we're able to get closer to what we want as a collective. Think of others when you're doing this too, and think about how you can teach another person in their venture, if you're already far along in your own, how you can educate others. As my favorite proverb is and goes, each one teach one. Take care. Thank you for tuning in.